All right, let's begin. So thanks for joining us today for this program on alternative vocabularies. I'm Jessica Philippe, the Member Engagement Librarian at the South Central Regional Library Council. We're using Zoom webinar today, so your mics and cameras are off for the duration of the webinar, but you're welcome to post questions to the chat. Joining us is Sasha Frizzell. She's the Catalog Metadata Management Librarian at Binghamton University. Welcome, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you everyone for tuning in today so we can talk about alternative vocabularies and what to do if you find that LCSH isn't enough. So my name is Sasha Frizzell, as you heard, and I started my career as a cataloger at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts Library. And that's when I started to use alternative vocabularies. Since it's a special library inside the art museum, I found that we had a lot of materials on the same topics, and it was really important to get very granular subject access for our patron base. And using only Library of Congress subject headings would sometimes cause my subject access to be too broad, or I would have trouble finding controlled terms that described kind of the form and features of physical items, especially if you're working with rare or special collections resources, and I want to capture some of that physicality of the book. And as you heard from Jessica, I'm now one of the catalogers at Binghamton University, and we still run into a lot of those same problems working with items in Binghamton. So I had created this presentation to help our catalogers here and introduce some alternative vocabularies just to bridge any gaps that might be happening in our cataloging. Throughout the presentation, I'm talking a lot about my personal workflow and about the way that I think of things when I'm cataloging. And you might find in your practice using alternative vocabularies that it looks a little bit different. But I'm still hopeful that this will give you some ideas and practical examples of how these can be useful and how you could integrate different vocabularies into your daily cataloging workflow. I'm covering three basic things today. So I want to talk about what alternative vocabularies are and why we would use them. I want to introduce you to 4 alternative vocabularies and give you some information on how I use them in the record and what I use them to describe. And then we'll look at actual MARC records. Next, I'm going to give you examples of records that I've enhanced with vocabularies. So we'll look at the original book record. I'll point out the gaps that I saw as I'm cataloging, and then I'm going to show you the enhanced record with the alternative vocabularies integrated into them. And then finally, if you're really new to alternative vocabularies, sometimes I think it can be challenging to decide when you want to start integrating them into your work. So I'm closing out with a decision tree that basically helps me weigh out the benefits into adding some of these languages. And when it may not be worth as much of my time to do that. And if you're really stuck and you're having trouble finding the exact terms you're looking for, I added a few kind of tips and tricks that I use if I really just can't find the term I need, or I don't have the capacity to dig through all these vocabularies to find exactly what I'm looking for. So why do you need an alternative vocabulary? And also alternative to what? I don't think we've touched too much on that. So Library of Congress subject headings, which I'm going to call LCSH through most of this, are kind of the primary subject headings used by catalogers. And I'm sure most, if not all of us here who catalog books, primarily create records using LCSH. But like I mentioned in the introduction, sometimes they just don't have the right term. In cataloging, we focus on accuracy and we focus on finding precise terms to describe topics. So not being able to find something that's the right fit is super frustrating. And at the end of the day, it might make that book less accessible to the people who want to find it. And ultimately, what we're hoping to do is increase accessibility and visibility for our resources. So we want to always make sure that we're capturing that subject access. LCSH can also occasionally lag behind the way that we use language in day-to-day life. And that leaves us to use outdated language to describe the resources that we're working with. And there are a few reasons why we see this lag. if you're not familiar with the process, here's a few little things that go on with Library of Congress subject headings. So first, LCSH bases their terms off of literary warrant. So that means that something has to be published about the topic before it can be considered important enough to be a subject heading. We can also find that some subject headings, because they're based on older literary warrant or older publishing, use terms that were created by colonizers or medical professionals or academics that are not the terms that people in those communities use to call themselves. That can be challenging to find an appropriate and a respectful subject heading. Another reason there's some lag with LCSH, and something that I personally tend to forget, is that LCSH is from the Library of Congress of the United States. As we saw a couple years ago with that back and forth about the subject heading illegal aliens, there is some hesitancy from LCSH to change terms if that change would be deemed too political. They want to make sure in some cases that the terms we're using in LCSH align with the kind of administrative policies that are coming forward through Congress. Third, getting terms through the process, if you don't work for the Library of Congress, is kind of a long administrative process. Writing a proposal for a new subject heading takes time, and it takes a lot of expertise. Once you have that subject heading proposal, it then can take weeks or months before the proposal is brought forward through the editorial board. And then if it's brought forward and they require revisions or changes, that then adds more time on between when you've had the resource in hand and when you actually get a subject heading that you can use in your bibliographic record. But it is actually a very interesting process. If you have any interest at all, their editorial meetings are open to the public via Zoom. I've sat in on a few. They're really enlightening. They're extremely welcoming, but it does help you get some perspective on kind of the long-term process for those headings. So because of some of this lag and because of some of the gaps, the Project for Cooperative Cataloging made a statement that PCC and other catalogers should really feel empowered to integrate alternative vocabularies. So the question is, where do you find these? We know where to find LCSH. Well, there are a lot. There's a lot. If you have not looked at the LOC MARC office page, there's hundreds of vocabularies that are authorized for use in MARC and as with OCLC codes with them. If you haven't looked at them or dug too deeply, I do want to note a lot of those are paywalled or they're not online. They're just in like printed books or pamphlets. Many of them are going to represent other languages or other countries' national vocabularies. And then some are for very specific industries. I saw on there the chiropractic thesaurus, thesaurus for use in college and university archives. So those would be very useful if you are working in one of those specific areas, or if you're a multilingual librarian and want to add subject access in another language. That's a great place to start looking for controlled vocabularies. But a lot of them are not going to work super well for general use. Any of the thesauri that are available to be used in OCLC in that list, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend using all of them. Language changes and updates over time, we know that, and we use these controlled vocabularies, and we need to make sure they're keeping up with the change that language produces. So we don't want to put our time and energy into learning a new vocabulary only for it to become outdated or to fall out of use. A lot of vocabularies on that MARC website haven't been updated in a long time, or it isn't clear at all when they were updated. And I know I don't want to start relying on a vocabulary and then one day go to their website and find it's been taken down. So I've tried to be very, very intentional about what vocabularies I'm using to make sure they stay relevant for as long as possible, so I can keep them in my toolkit as long as possible. Listed on this slide are just my basic criteria for what I'm looking for before integrating a new vocabulary into bibliographic records. First, I want it to be authorized for use in MARC. I work in MARC, so if it's not authorized in MARC, that's kind of a deal breaker for my current cataloging situation. But if you're not working in MARC, then you do have other flexibility. Say, if, for example, you're creating a digital exhibition in Dublin Core, and you find you have some more flexibility, you want to work in a different vocabulary. There's a website called Linked Open Vocabularies, and that has 846 vocabularies to choose from. So many options out there. But if you're working in MARC, I'd recommend just using that first website. Secondly, I want the vocabulary to be transparently and well-maintained. I'm hoping to see version histories. I want access to the versions. If things are being changed, I want that change to be communicated to users on a regular basis to make sure that we're using the most updated information. And thirdly, I want information about how and who updates the vocabulary. I'm very hesitant to use vocabularies that exist in a closed system where other people can't offer feedback for change. Ideally, a vocabulary is going to be sourced by the community it represents, and is open about its process for accepting new terms or its process for revising and removing old terms. Finally, I'm going to award bonus points for linked data interoperability. I'm hopeful our systems move in that direction, and even if they don't, it can't hurt. So bonus points for linked data. Before we get into the meat of the presentation where I introduce these vocabularies, I just want to take a quick moment before we get started to address kind of a general anxiety that seems to come up when we talk about adding alternative vocabularies. A lot of the time, we're using these vocabularies to describe people because LCSH terms are outdated or don't fit. And as good catalogers, we want to describe people respectfully. And sometimes this causes a little bit of hesitation because folks think they need to know the right term for everything, or they think they need to do a lot of extensive research, or they feel that they aren't equipped to work outside of LCSH. Language changes and opinions on terminology differ from person to person. The good news is we know that going into this work. We will sometimes get terminology wrong, and cataloging is always an iterative process. So what seems like a good record or a good subject heading today could seem outdated or inaccurate tomorrow, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't still strive to do good records. One of the steps, kind of one of the best steps, I think, to moving towards making those good records is to use terminology a community uses to describe itself, which I mentioned in the last slide. Allowing people to self-identify and then honoring that self-identification, I believe ultimately help us connect the right users to the right resources. And that's what catalogers are here to do. So I've been lucky enough to dedicate some of my time to reparative cataloging work. And I've found very frequently when I need to update outdated terminology, it's because we prefer a controlled vocabulary term over a term that the group or resource uses to describe itself. And throughout this presentation, I have a few examples where I've selected new subject headings or added new subject headings based on terminology used by the resource, so you can see exactly what I mean when I talk about that. So hopefully that's helpful. But jumping in, here are the 4 vocabularies that I find I use very often in my cataloging work. I use the Library of Congress demographic group terms, Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, Rare Books and Manuscripts Controlled Vocabulary, and Homosaurus. Over the next few slides, I'm going to explain where that vocabulary comes from, how it's updated, where you can find it, and then show you an example of it being used in a MARC record, just so you can see what it looks like in action. We're starting out here, the Library of Congress demographic group terms, also from the Library of Congress. But unlike Library of Congress subject headings, which are just based on literary warrant, the Library of Congress demographic group terms, which I'll probably say LCDGT through the rest of this presentation, are created based on literary and user and organizational warrant So they've expanded the scope out kind of to better capture what users and organizations might need. This vocabulary is used primarily for creator, contributor, or audience characteristics. I use it really frequently for creating NACO authority records, but I think folks in public or school libraries could also find it really helpful for adding audience characteristics. You can find PDFs on the LOC website, or you can search id.loc.gov. And if you have a subscription, you can also find this vocabulary on ClassWeb. On this slide, and kind of all of the slides where I'm explaining and giving examples of the vocabulary, I've listed what I use the vocabulary for or what I look to it for. And I've provided a term that doesn't exist in LCSH, so you can get a better feel for where it might help you fill gaps. So for example, in my second set of bullets there, I've added protein chemists, which I could not find in LCSH, but does exist in LCDGT. And I use LCDGT for a few different topics. If I'm looking to describe Indigenous people, if I'm having trouble finding the name preferred by a group of Indigenous people, especially, LCDGT is a good option for an alternative. It also has the term Indigenous people of North America. So if you're working with a resource that prefers Indigenous over the term Indian or over the term Native American, this is a good place to source the term Indigenous people of North America. That is not available in LCSH. I use this vocabulary also super frequently for occupations. It's helpful for audience characteristics, I think, and I use it primarily in authority work for picking occupation or sometimes field of work. This is also a good place to check if you're looking for people first language. So LCDGT has the term, for example, people with cerebral palsy, and the LCSH term is cerebral palsied. So slightly different. People first language in general is kind of a great example of why I prefer to take my cues from the resource itself. Not every community agrees with the use of people first language. For example, there's a lot of discussion and debate over people with autism versus autistic people. Terms like these are kind of the reasons why I just try to prefer the term the resource sets out for me and not what I might think is more appropriate. The author has already made a specific choice about language, and I'm just going to do my best to represent that in the record for current resources. I think LCDGT too is a great option for folks who feel they may not be supported in integrating alternative vocabularies created by non-LC entities. Now we have a real example. So here we have two examples of what using the LCDGT in a MARC 386 that creator field looks like. This is the poems of Alexander Lawrence Posey. And in the new, those kind of highlighted 386 field, we note that the author is Muskogee from the North American people, and we note that the author is a humorist. Alexander Lawrence Posey was a very active advocate for the Muskogee people, and he's well known for his political satire that looked at clashes between the Muskogee and kind of colonizing cultures. These other extra descriptors could help folks looking for, say, Muskogee poets. So now we have, this is a book of poems, and it's also by a Muskogee person. This is a book of poems who's also by a humorist. So someone who's looking to connect those two bubbles, adding this additional term could help do that. I also appreciate here, if we look at the 246 here, this is the Creek Indian poet. So now we have both Muskogee and Creek Indian here. So we're kind of capturing keywords that could be used by a bunch of different researchers, and we're increasing the accessibility of this work by adding the additional terms. Another kind of important point I want to emphasize with these creator and contributor characteristics specifically is that I'm only going to be adding these if the creator or contributor self-identifies by a certain term. And I'm going to use the term that they use specifically. So just because it looks like, oh, the name Alexander looks like it is a male name. I wouldn't add male poets on here or male humorists on here. I would only do that if he had said, I am a male humorist. I am a man from the Muskogee tribe. So I would use things that I know are self-identified, and then use the terms that they use for themselves. And that's kind of one of the reasons that I love alternative vocabularies, is because they give me the flexibility of finding terms that people are using and not something adjacent that could cover or carry different connotations. LCDGT is good too, because they don't affix the term Indians to the end of every term about Indigenous people. So some folks are okay with the term Indian, others prefer not to use it. And LCDGT gives me an opportunity to describe people based on the way they describe themselves. So it's just a good tool to have additional options if you find you have something in your hand and you can't represent the terminology that exists there with LCSH. The next option is Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus. This is created and maintained by an editorial board at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and the vocabulary is freely available on their website. I go to AAT if I need to describe something about art or architecture, surprisingly. So if I need to describe a specific art style, we have AAT's Czech Cubism. In LCSH, we could get close, we could get Cubism, and then we could geographically divide it. But it doesn't capture the exact nuance of the term Czech Cubism. This isn't just Cubism that existed in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. It has certain different nuances and different techniques that are used that don't apply to Cubism generally. So if I can get the better term as Czech Cubism, I'm going to use that from AAT. AAT is also great for art forms. So here I have the example of face vessels, and AAT have a lot of scope notes and descriptions and details for their vocabulary. So this one has the definition of stylized stoneware vessels depicting a human face with white clay inserted for eyes and teeth, manufactured by African Americans in South Carolina and possibly Alabama and northern Florida during the 19th century. In LCSH, we can get close. We could get face and art. We could add sculpture, South Carolina, 19th century. But that doesn't cover everything that face vessels is and kind of the historical and contextual information that the term face vessels gives us. So if I can be more precise, why not do that? AAT is also good for describing physical artistic portions of the book. So if you're describing special collections or rare books, AAT is a great place to go to source terms. I have my third option here. I use it for art techniques. And we could use that to describe what the book is about, or we could use it to describe what the book is, depending on where we put it. We could put it in a 650 or a 655. That gives us a little bit of flexibility with those. Or kind of some book binding terms. So I have accordion album bindings here. Something that's related to the physical form of the book. There's a lot of good places in AAT to capture, especially with bindings. I appreciate AAT also because it explicitly states if a term is outdated or no longer used to describe a certain culture or style or people. That's super helpful if I'm working with resources that are, 50 or 100 or 200 years old. It'll tell me right up front, hey, we don't use this term anymore. Maybe look here instead. And then you can make your decision what you want to apply. So here we have an example of the AAT in use. It's an artist book called Offering at the Crossroads. And one of the interesting features of this book is it's inspired by a Balinese palm book. And they're kind of these palm slats that are all brought together and kind of rolled up. But this particular artist book is unbound, and it has a teak wood cover, and it's part of a limited edition. And we were able to capture that in a 500, but we were also able to use AAT and 655s in order to get that controlled terms to be indexed. So we have teak wood, which is the wood that's made out of the cover, unbound volumes, artist books, and limited editions. These extra terms are just especially helpful if you have a large collection of artist books and say you only want to find the ones that are unbound. Now you have terms we can use to connect them together just to get a little bit more granular with the responses that we're pulling up. You might see here, if you were looking through here, that we've duplicated the term artist books. So we have one in LCSH and we have one as AAT in 655. We have artist book specimens in 650, and then we have the artist books in 655. There are some pros and cons to this practice. So the pros are you are increasing uses of the alternative vocabulary, which could make other folks more aware of it and kind of bring it more visibility if you add the term a second time. You're adding that term more consistently to your catalog, and therefore it's more likely to be useful to researchers and patrons if you have it more consistently. And the most compelling reason for me is that you have some protection for the term if LCSH decided to change their term completely. Say LCSH decided, we don't like artist books, we want books by artists. That gets reverted in all of the OCLC records. You'd at least have the artist books in AAT as kind of that consistent term. That reversion makes more sense if we're talking about groups of people. That's where we tend to see that a little bit more often, but here's the example we have. And the con is obviously it requires some additional effort. If you're not familiar with the vocabulary, it might take you a little bit more time to find. And you probably won't get a lot of immediate benefit from the addition. So it is good practice just to look for the words so you can get more familiar with the vocabulary, but it's really up to you to decide if it's something, if you want to duplicate those words in there, or if you're okay with just keeping it as the LC artist books up at the top. Our third option here is the Rare Books and Manuscripts Controlled Vocabulary for Rare Materials Cataloging. It's created and maintained by an editorial group from the ACRL Rare Books and Manuscripts section. It's available at id.loc.gov. And while it's from the Rare Books section, the terms can really be applied to any type of resource. So even if you don't do rare or special collections cataloging, it could still be useful, especially if you're describing the form of something. Anything non-traditional, this is a good place to go for. I use these terms a lot when I need a genre term that isn't available from the Library of Congress genre form term vocabulary. So Library of Congress genre form term has a lot of normal terms, stuff that you'll see in a everyday library. But if I need something more specific, like in the example here, alphabet wheels, then RBMS CD would be a good place to look. It's also a good place for printing terms. So anything that needs to capture special aspects of the printing or the formation of the book. They recently released their work for the prejudicial working group, and that includes anti-terms, which are kind of a new vocabulary. So we get terms like anti-communist works. It can be really tough to find a bucket for prejudicial works that connect those ties between them. And this is really one of the few vocabularies that we can use to easily co-locate those types of materials for researchers. I also use RBMS CV if the book was given for some kind of special occasion. So I'm sure there's a much more technical term for that. But if it has a signature or an inscription or some type of writing, a special decorative page inserted, something that makes the physical copy exceptional or different from other things, I like to go to RBMS CV for those types of vocabulary terms. So here is our example. On the left, we have a beautiful publisher's binding, the illustration on the front. This book, you can't see, if you could open it, you could see there is also a presentation inscription, and there's tons of illustrations in there. So it's important that we capture all those special features in the record. We do have some of that information in a 500, so it does exist, but as always, adding those control terms is going to give us more specific findings when we're looking for things. Here in this record, we have a couple of genre form terms added from this vocabulary. We have publishers' cloth bindings, pictorial bindings, presentation inscriptions, and illustrated works. So while we have that information in some of the metadata, this is just creating easier ties to co-locate materials with these publisher bindings or these inscriptions. Especially with the physical details, this could be helpful if you have folks who are teaching a lot with rare materials and they like to bring out certain materials to their classes. This is a good way to help kind of building those threads and building those little libraries of publishers' bindings or pictorial bindings. As a little caveat here, so when we start to talk about the terms we're assigning because of the physical features of the book, we always want to be sure it applies to every copy of the book that could be using this bib record. If it doesn't, we aren't sure if it does, then we can add a subfield 5 with our institution code on the end. That tells people with the bib record, okay, Binghamton University has something that has a presentation inscription, but not everyone should expect to have that. In this record, the way that it is here, we assume that all copies have that same illustrated binding, the same inscriptions. If not, we would adjust to add that subfield 5 for ours, or you can add that information in a local note. It really depends on your practice and what makes the most sense with your ILS and your discovery layer. Finally, we have Homosaurus. Just to note, if you've never used this vocabulary before, it does not shy away from sexually explicit terms. There are ways you can search and browse for specific terms, but you're likely going to see something explicit if you're using this vocabulary. So that's great if you're cataloging resources that need those terms, but if it's something you prefer to avoid, then this might not be the right fit for your toolbox. But the vocabulary itself is created and maintained by an international board of queer information professionals. It's available for free on their website. They have a really great logo. This vocabulary is good if you want to address a specific identity, like queer neurodivergent people. It's great if you are describing any type of identity that includes the term queer. That term does not exist in LCSH. This is a good resource if you're looking for something about a specific sexual or gender identity. For example, Homosaurus has demigender, which I have listed here. Versus LCSH, the closest we're going to get is gender nonconforming people, which is sort of a broader umbrella than we need. And the term demigender is just more precise and could be more accurate to the resource. And what more do catalogers want than precise and accurate? So if you're looking for something a little bit more specific, this is a good place to go. If you want to use the term LGBTQ+ at all, this is the vocabulary you should go to. LC, you'd likely be using something like sexual minorities, which just might not capture the subject the way that we want to capture it. And kind of most surprisingly, it's great for describing zine and fandom culture. So if you have a bunch of zines or a bunch of fandom materials, this is a great tool for finding resources for that vocabulary. Here is an example of the use in a MARC record. This book, The Intermediate Sex, was kind of a forward-thinking explanation of homosexuality. And the record has the LCSH subject headings of homosexuality, gay men, and lesbians. And that does capture some of what this book is about, but it doesn't really capture like Carpenter's overarching argument about sexuality as a spectrum. It doesn't capture a lot of the nuance. But if we add something like Homosaurus' sexual identity, we see a little bit more of that spectrum and we get a little bit more information about the topic. The term Uranism is outdated, but it is the term that is used in the book itself. If you look in Homosaurus, you'll see a lot of the terms have scope notes that remind you to only use them in historical context, which is really helpful. Because that's the term used in this book, I think that it's appropriate to add to the MARC record so researchers of this period who are familiar with the term can easily find it. I would never apply this to a new source just because I thought the definition of that term seemed to fit the topic. But because we're using the exact terminology the resource has given us, I feel comfortable adding that here. I'd also like to note, I don't know if the LCSH in this record totally capture the topic of this book, but that does not mean I'm going to remove them. 99% of the work I do with alternative subject headings is additive. I've talked to a lot of folks about it, and sometimes they get concerned that you're using alternatives, you're getting rid of the LCSH, and you absolutely don't have to do that. I know I can't account for other people's library and discovery systems. I know some discovery systems scrub out anything that's not a Library of Congress subject heading, and I'm not going to be responsible for removing subject access to a book in someone else's system. The only time I would go through and actively remove a subject heading was if it was just objectively incorrect. And that's the same thing that I would do if I was working on any bib record. Subject heading is wrong, and I have the resources to back me up that it's wrong, I'll change it, and that's going to improve it for everyone. And really, at the end of the day, adding these alternative vocabularies is about improving these records for everyone. So now we have the fun part. We have these alternative vocabularies in our toolbox. We have some understanding of when and how we can use them to fill gaps. But what I want to do next is present two records. We're going to look at the current record, how I found it. I'm going to talk about the gaps that I saw. I'm going to talk about the vocabularies I would use to fill those gaps. And then I'm going to show you the enhanced record. So here we have the work of Afro-American women by Mrs. Mosel. And this is the original record. And it's a great record. This is already a very good record. The subject headings cover that it's about African-American women, it's about authorship, and its history and criticism. When we start to get into the notes sections, we can see that we have advertisements here. We can see we have information about the publisher's binding, and we have a great 505 note. So we've covered a lot already in this record. But if I had time and I had capacity, there are a few places I would enhance using alternative vocabularies. First, I would try to add controlled terms for all of that physical description that we provided in the 563 binding note. We could find terms for advertisements, and we can find terms for publishers' bindings. Having the book in hand, I can also see that Mrs. Mosel was an African-American woman and a journalist in the late 19th century. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to bring to the creator characteristic for this book. So our little matrix. I have on the left what I want to capture, in the middle, kind of what it is, what bucket am I throwing it in, and then what vocabulary I would check based on that. So I know I want to capture that there are advertisements. That's a physical feature of the book. So I want to look at RBMS, CV, or AAT. I want to capture binding, also a physical feature. I'm going to look at those same two vocabularies for the term. Finally, I want to capture that author characteristic. That's that 386 note. So I'm going to probably first look at LCSH because that's kind of the most comfortable place for me. And that's where I'm the fastest at finding things. But if I can't find it there, then I'm going to look to LCDGT. So here we have the example. The left is the before. And like I said, it's already a great record. What we're doing with the alternative vocabularies on the right is helping to capture these unique figures in a controlled language. And at the end of the day, we're just here to help folks find, identify, select, and explore. So these additional controlled terms will help folks do that. If someone were looking for books by, say, African-American journalists from before 1900, this creator characteristic, along with our what do we have here? Our 264 note will help us kind of tie the thread between these two places, and it could help to surface work that the researcher didn't know existed and help them find a new journalist to explore. If a patron wanted to find publishers' advertisements from Philadelphia within a certain time frame, being able to pull all these pieces of metadata together will help us find the most accurate bucket to get them the results they're really looking for. In the actual record itself, You can see that we've added the 386 field for author African-American journalists from the LCSH. It was available in LCSH. That's the first place I look, so I'm going to use it. And then at the bottom, we have advertisements from the Rare Books Manuscript Controlled Vocabulary and Publisher's Cloth Bindings from AAT. So now that you have these additional tools, you can decide if these are the types of enhancements that bring value to your patrons and decide how to integrate them into your workflows. This is our last example, and this one's a little bit of a leaner record. This is the Home Cookbook, compiled by Ladies of Toronto and Chief Cities and Towns of Canada from 1887. It's the 70th edition. This was extremely popular. In this original record, we have subject headings of Cooking Canadian, which is uncontrolled, Cooking Canada, which are both roughly valid subject headings, but it feels like we could pull out additional aspects of this work through this record. What you can't see from just this title page is that this copy has a wooden binding that's stamped on the back from the publisher. And we could definitely add genre terms for cookbooks. The book itself also has some other recipes like housekeeping or like domestic task recipes, silver polish and things like that. And we can also refine these subject headings to tease out the actual content of the book. This isn't just Canadian cooking. It's Canadian cooking in the 19th century, which could be an important distinction. So if someone who's looking for current Canadian cooking probably doesn't want the several suet pudding recipes in this book. Maybe they do. I hope they find them. So what I want to capture is the wooden binding, which is a physical feature of the book. So I'm looking at RBMS, CV, or AAT. I want to capture that it's a cookbook. That's a genre form term. I'm first looking at LCGT, and I know this one will be in there. But if it was something a little bit more rare, a little bit more abstract, then AAT or RBMS CV would be the places I would go next. I want to capture that this book was written by Canadian folks, which I can do with the 386. And I want to capture that this is Canadian cookbook from the 19th century. So I want to enhance that 6XX, and I know I can do that with LCSH. So here we have our before and our after. We've added a few terms and we've tightened up a few little things. We've added the 386 authors for Canadians. You can, for LCDGT especially, you can also do specific cities. They have demonyms or like terms for people in the places where they are. So Torontonians, if this was only compiled by the Ladies of Toronto, but since it was also and Chief Cities and Towns in Canada, I felt Canadians is probably the better option for us here. We've kind of restructured a few of the 500s to put it together and added some more information about what else is in there. I've adjusted the 650 to include that 19th century time span. I think that's an important aspect of this book, especially at the 70th edition, where it could span different portions of time, even with the same title. We have the 655 now, which is pulled from that LCGT. But like I said, if this was something a little bit more unique, I would have gone to RBMS, CV, or AAT for it. And then we have the publisher's bindings. In this case, like I explained before, I don't know where this publisher's binding came from, and I don't know if everyone's copy was this fancy. Especially for the 70th edition, like a wood published copy seems very fancy for what it is. So I've added the subfield 5 and the university code on there, just so we can make sure that we're capturing that we have a publisher's binding, but I don't know if you have a publisher's binding. So now we've seen examples, but kind of in our day-to-day workflow, how do we decide when we want to actually integrate some of these vocabularies, and how do we decide when to just leave a record as is? I created a kind of a basic decision tree that helps me decide if I should enhance something or if it's okay as it is. I do most of this math mentally, but I wanted to write it out so you could follow exactly what I'm thinking about when I decide to make these decisions. So we start at the top. Is the resource well described by the record? If yes, we go left and we go to the bottom. There is no need to add an alternative vocabulary. And I'm emphasizing need. You still can. You may find that you do want to start adding duplicated terms. You may find that you want to just make some enhancements, but there's no need to add an alternative vocabulary. You can leave that record as is. If you don't have time or capacity, then the record's getting imported and you can move on to your next item. So we go back up to the top. Is then the resource well described by the record? And it's not. Well, my next thought, is there something special about the physical form of the resource? Yes. If there is, I'm looking to an alternative vocabulary to describe that. I have not had a lot of luck, as I mentioned before, with looking for describing physical forms with LC vocabularies. So I'm probably going to RBMS CV or I'm going to AAT to capture those things. You may find for your workflow it's different, but that's kind of where I've landed in my use with controlled vocabularies. But if we go back, is there something special about the physical form? No. Well, then do the subject headings capture what it's about? If yes, then there's no need to add anything. You have an okay record. If we start at the top, the resource well described by the record, it is not. There's nothing special about the physical form and the subject headings don't work. Well, now you have a decision. Can you enhance it with LCSH? If you can, then you could use the LCSH. I think that's something we're most familiar with. That's how we're going to be the quickest. That's how we're going to be the most efficient, is using the LCSH. If, however, you get to a point where you just can't enhance this record the way that you'd like to using the LCSH, I'd recommend going to an alternative vocabulary just to seeing how you can capture these things. If you've noticed it about the resource, you want to be able to capture it and show that to your patrons. So finally, what if you get to a point where you have looked through these alternative vocabularies, you've spent a little bit too much time on a single resource, and you just cannot find a term that you're looking for? What do? This is how I generally handle it. My first response is always look to see what other librarians have done. We are a very creative bunch. We will find solutions. So I want to see what someone else has done to help in this situation. And sometimes that's a good lead. Sometimes I'm not able to find something. If I don't have time or capacity to dig in and do all of this research, but I know a term feels important to a resource and I can't find it, I'm going to enter a blurb in a 520 field. Or if the term is used in a title, I'm going to put it in a 505. I'm going to enter that 505 to make sure we're at least getting some level of keyword access for this term. Whatever we can do to get the terms into their a 500 field. You could even do uncontrolled keywords if you wanted to. I'm not the biggest fan of those, but if that is what works for your cataloging workflow, then if you're getting the term in there, that's great. Finally, the last thing you can do, and kind of the longest possible solution, is to reach out to either a Seiko funnel or to the editorial board of one of these vocabularies and try to create a new heading. Like I said much earlier on in this presentation, that can be a longer process. That's going to take the longest amount of time to go from resource in hand to subject heading. But we're using LCSH every day. We want to improve it. We're using these alternative vocabularies more and more. We want to improve them and make sure that they stay up to date. So I'll always advocate for, if you can't find a term and you have capacity, kind of move forward and do your best to improve it overall, because I'm certain that if you are cataloging something and you can't find a term, someone else has probably run into the same problem. So we want to fix it long term if we can. But that's everything I have to say about alternative vocabularies today. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Thanks, Sasha. Thanks for being such a thoughtful cataloger.
Yes, I do my best.
Well, that makes me curious. Have you ever created a new heading?
Not yet. But I am actually part of the subject analysis committee with ALA. So we're working on a few right now to go through. So I'm very familiar. That process, it can take months and months and months sometimes to get a new heading out there. So
can you share what they might be, or
Right now, we're working on, we have a working group where we have subject headings with question in them. So very outdated. There is like the Jewish question, or there's a whole list of them. So we're looking at all of those and seeing, should these exist anymore? Is this relevant historically and it needs a scope note? Should this be reverted to a different language? We obviously don't want to remove anything that's helpful, but we don't need to keep anything that's outdated either.
Mhm. Does anyone else have questions? Feel free to put those in the chat. And I'm also going to put a quick survey in there while I'm thinking of it. I'm also curious about, on an average day, how many items would you catalog then, given that it looks pretty time intensive for some of them?
It can be. So if we're working on special collections, normally I'd say between 5 and 10 a day if we have a full day of cataloging, especially if those are in languages I might not know. That could take a little bit more time. But also I do split my time between cataloging and metadata. So I do a lot of the digital side as well. But we try to do about 10 a day or so.
Mm-hmm.
It does too. It's like a muscle. The more you use the alternative vocabularies, the more I'm like, yes, I know I'm going to AAT for this. I'm not even looking anywhere else. So it becomes almost as easy as going to LCSH, which speeds it up a little bit.
You got to practice.
Yes.
Nice. Not seeing any questions come through the chat, so I do just want to share with everybody that next week we'll send out a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. And if you didn't get enough of alternative vocabularies today, Sasha's going to be at the SUNY Law Conference next month, right?
Yay. Yes, I will be.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I hope that everybody gets to enjoy this beautiful afternoon.
Thanks so much, everyone.